Good afternoon, everyone, to those of you joining us in the room and also to those of you joining us online. Welcome to this rather special session of IISD's 2022 Trade and Sustainability Hub. My name is Alice Tipping and I lead IISD's work on trade policy. And I'm going to be moderating the first part of this session, which focuses on the role of trade and trade policy in the race to preserve our natural environment. We're actually delivering this part of the session from the WTO in Geneva, which is hosting the 12th Ministerial Conference. And I'm delighted to be joined by representatives of 3 WTO members whose governments are leading key initiatives that groups of WTO members are pursuing. We have Minister Ng, Canada's Minister of Trade. I'm delighted to welcome Wendy Matthews, the Director of the Trade Negotiations Division of the New Zealand Government, and Mr. Daniel Legarda, who is Vice Minister of International Trade of Ecuador. We're going to ask each of these representatives to speak briefly about one of the initiatives that's going on. We'll ask Minister Ng to speak first, partly because we understand she has to leave just before 2. But we'll ask her to speak about the trade and environmental sustainability structured discussions, which currently involve 74 members with the addition of 1 more overnight. That covers quite a range of environmental issues. Wendy Matthews will talk about efforts underway to advance the issue of fossil fuel subsidy reform at the WTO under a joint ministerial statement on that topic. And Mr. Daniel Legarda will present the informal dialogue on plastics pollution and environmentally sustainable plastics, which is a discussion involving around 72 WTO members. And it's worth highlighting just briefly that all WTO members are able to sit in on all of these 3 processes and join them as co-sponsors if they wish. But these initiatives are not by far the first discussions on trade and environment that have taken place at the WTO. And in fact, the topic has a long-standing place in the WTO's existing institutional structure and its history. And to help us understand this context, I'll turn the floor at the very end to an old-time friend, Aiko Lim, who is the Director of the Trade and Environment Division at the WTO, for a few remarks perhaps on the evolution and the role of multilateral discussions on trade and environment before we close. So I'm very conscious that ministers will need to return to the formal agenda of the ministerial in half an hour. So we're going to close this part of the session at 2 p.m. and I understand, Minister Ng, if you need to leave a little bit before that. So after that, we're going to turn to the second part of the roundtable, which is a discussion amongst a number of key trade and environment stakeholders who will discuss a difficult question, which is whether the trade system is currently doing enough to respond to the many environmental challenges that governments are grappling with. And there'll be an opportunity for discussion and questions and answers from those of you joining us online at the end of that second part of the roundtable. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat box and I'll be handing over moderation at the end of this part to my colleague Eva Barszczowskaite, who you can see online. So it will be a team effort all the way through. So with that short word of introduction, I might give the floor first to you, Minister Ng. Go ahead, please.
Well, Alice, thank you so very much for that kind introduction. It's terrific to be here at the WTO with you and, of course, my colleagues from the other countries who are here on the panel, and my ambassador, who is at the back of the room over here. But the reason I start there is because so much work goes into these dialogues, and as a minister, you get to come into a ministerial like this, and you get to say, you certainly get to say a few words, but I really do want to underline my appreciation and thank you for the tremendous work that is done to facilitate these dialogues. And I also want to give a word of appreciation and thank you to the many stakeholders who are here. I think about the work that we do in Canada and in our part here in the WTO, and you always have to ask yourself, who are you doing it for? We are doing it for our people. We are doing it for our workers. We are doing it for our businesses, and we are doing it for the planet. That's the context in which we must always ground ourselves in. I had a wonderful meeting this morning where we are reminded. I mean, particular for me, I'm Canada's Minister for International Trade for Canada, but I also hold the small business responsibility. And there, I'm often reminded that the work that we do on the international trade side, which much of it, and particularly here at the WTO, is around making those rules, but those rules have got to serve the purpose to which we are making those rules. So at the end of the day, as I said, people, workers, businesses, our planet. And when we make the rules that are trade, it isn't really just about the countries or the businesses who use them. It's equally important who uses them, and we need to strive always to be as inclusive as we can, so that trade really does yield the benefits and can be a part of the solution, whether it is in our economies or whether it is on an issue so important as that of fighting climate change and creating a sustainable world. So it's really terrific that I get the floor today to talk about the work of the trade and environmentally sustainable trade structured discussions. You see that you're in government, you're so used to using the acronym. So TESTI is what I know it to be, but reading it aloud, took a couple of syllables and a garbling of the tongue. So my apologies. But TESTI was launched in November of 2020, and with the co-sponsorship of 50 WTO members. And we in Canada, along with Costa Rica, get to take a bit of a leadership role. But really, I think that at the WTO, leadership is really leadership among we are leaders among equals. And the members who were there, these 50, share the belief that international trade and trade-related environmental policies can really be an enabler towards a transition to climate neutral, to resource efficiency, to a circular global economy, while at the same time supporting global efforts to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and international environmental commitments. It's really terrific to know that the progressive interests of members, where it started at 50, has now grown to 72 co-sponsors, with the most recent addition of Tajikistan. And since the launch of these discussions, our co-sponsors have worked constructively to create an agenda that addresses a wide range of interests where trade and the environment intersect. These issues range from climate change mitigation and adaptation to sustainable agriculture and environmental goods and services. Overall, we've been heartened with the level of interest and engagement among WTO members in addressing the environmental challenges through a trade policy lens. And in December of 2021, TESTI co-sponsors adopted a ministerial declaration confirming their diverse interests on trade and environmental issues, as well as identifying thematic areas that would serve as a backbone for a work program. And since the launch of this statement, TESTI members have decided to intensify this work and this focus, and established informal working groups based on 4 thematic areas: environmental goods and services, trade-related climate measures, circular economy and circularity, environmentally harmful subsidies. My apologies, I was just reading here. Canada and Costa Rica are co-chair here. We will lean on the support of the co-facilitators for each of these working groups so that we can facilitate these discussions in these 4 thematic areas. We want to thank Norway, Ecuador, Switzerland, Turkey, Japan, Chile, Iceland, and Uruguay for their leadership in this regard. And we hope that the discussions across these thematic areas will deliver positive outcomes as we move towards MC13. We expect that these informal working groups will deliver more clarity on the state of play in each of the thematic areas, which will be presented at a high-level stock-taking event that will be organized by the WTO at the end of the year. We'll also have an opportunity to hear the views and expertise of a number of stakeholders who participate in the TESTI meetings, the perspectives of the INGOs, international organizations, business communities. You'll bring a wealth of knowledge to these discussions. And in this regard, I want to thank give special thanks to ISSD for its active participation in TESTI, really right since the beginning, since its inauguration in November of 2020. TESTI really does provide that space for transparency and a dialogue among its participants, but it's also a place where it's an opportunity to learn more. It isn't just for the experts and stakeholders, but also from each other. And by asking questions and trying to answer them both in a collaborative way, but in a dynamic way. So really to be able to, in some ways through these discussions, make these discussions somewhat circular. This can be particularly interesting for developing countries and the least developed countries who have ongoing work experience in implementing nature-based solutions, but they also face a different set of challenges relating to climate change and in transitioning to a greener, more circular economy. So we invite those members who have not yet joined TESTI as a co-sponsor yet to do so. They are very welcomed. And in this, when I look at the WTO membership, it is really heartening to see that we have over 70 members. But I think this is an issue that affects all of us and it affects the entire membership. And the more we're able to not only work in the working groups that under these themes, and of course, we would be very interested, and I think the TESTI would be very interested in opening other themes should members wish that to be the case. So our doors are open and our delegations in Geneva are ready to engage and to assist members in that regard. And thank you so very much. And my apologies for having to leave early as things go here in the midst of WTO negotiations. One gets back into the room, for example, on fishery subsidies negotiations, because those are extremely important. But as well as agriculture and much of what we need to do here. So my apologies for having to leave early, but it's been terrific to be here with you.
Not at all, Minister, no apologies necessary at all. Thank you, rather, for giving us a bit of your time in what I know is an extremely busy week. So thank you to your team as well for facilitating that. I might pass the floor next perhaps to Ms. Matthews. Can you catch us up on the fossil fuel subsidies work underway?
Thanks, Alice, and thank you, Minister. I will start off with an apology, which is I am representing New Zealand here today because Minister O'Connor is currently facilitating the fish subsidies session, which we agree is of vital importance here at the WTO, and we really hope we can get strong trade and sustainability outcomes from that. Minister Ning also talked about the building momentum, and I'm really pleased to be here today to talk about the building momentum behind the fossil fuel subsidy reform statement as well. We launched this ministerial statement in December despite the postponement of NC12. We wanted to show that there was that momentum, that progress. This week, we continue to advance the conversation on the reform of inefficient subsidy fossil fuel subsidy reform, also a tongue twister. Fossil fuel subsidy reforms, fossil fuel subsidies we know distort trade and investment decisions, making it harder for renewable energy to compete. Subsidies are a well-established trade issue, and it therefore makes sense to pursue fossil fuel subsidy reform within the rules-based system of the WTO. I'm pleased to share that the membership is now co-sponsored by 47 WTO members, and these members are from a range of developed and developing countries and from across the globe. This number continues to grow, and most recently we welcomed Samoa and Paraguay as the newest co-sponsors. This is broad and growing responses and clear recognition that the trade community wants to contribute to global efforts to address climate change. In 2021, New Zealand and 20 other APEC economies made progress to turn the tide on fossil fuel subsidies in our region. While we know it will take time to remove these entrenched policies, we are pleased that we're making steps towards stopping the expansion of such policies. Also in COP26, 196 UN members explicitly acknowledged for the first time that fossil fuel subsidies must be reformed if we're to stay on the 1.5 degree pathway. Co-sponsors of this ministerial statement recognise the adverse trade, social and environmental impacts of fossil fuel subsidies. They seek the rationalisation and phase out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies along a clear timeline. The statement makes clear that the reform needs to take into account the specific needs and conditions of developing countries and minimise possible adverse impacts on development. It's never been a one-size-fits-all approach. This fundamental principle that will continue to guide our efforts. Co-sponsors have agreed to share information and experience with the aim of continuing to build a supportive international setting for addressing fossil fuel subsidies and to assist domestic reform efforts. Co-sponsors have now adopted a work program to help guide our efforts over coming months. This is to help us in our objective to elaborate concrete options for addressing this issue within the WTO ahead of MC13. We've set ourselves a timeframe so we can move towards action in a coherent and transparent manner. A key focus is on the development and social aspects of the fossil fuel subsidy reform in order to build greater support for our work and ensure a just transition. New Zealand also welcomes the updates from colleagues here today. We're very pleased to co-sponsor those initiatives as well. I'd like to conclude by thanking all the co-sponsoring WTO members for their support of the fossil fuel subsidy reform ministerial statement. And similarly, I would encourage further supporters to come on board. We want to keep that momentum growing. Through these efforts, we will support progress towards a cleaner future that contributes to the Marrakesh Agreement objective of sustainable development, seeking to protect and preserve the environment we all live in. Kia ora, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Wendy. That was really interesting. And I guess we're all hopeful that we'll see our first agreement on fuel subsidies to fishing a bit later this week. I'll give the floor next to you, Mr. Lagarda. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Alice. First of all, let me thank again and say hello to my colleague, Wendy Matthews. It's great to hear from you. And of course, Minister Maringi, who had to keep following the discussions as we all do on this important agenda. Again, good to see you, Director Lim, and thanks for being also here. Let me again thank IISID, the initiative of TES, UNEP, the Pew Charitable Trust, and some other stakeholders that have put also together the interest for this important conversation, and some others among an important environment and an important issue for all of us, that is taking care of the environment through the eyes of, or through the glasses of international trade. My acknowledge to you also. Thank you for moderating this panel. And of course, to, as Minister Ng said, also all thanks to all of our teams that have put together all this hard work and important to come for the next months. So on the matter of informal dialogue of plastic pollution, we did have yesterday an important meeting, and to establish this dialogue in order to contribute to informal, in the first instance, informal talks, but contribute to important advances with the contribution not only from the view for countries, but also from civil society, academia, and some other stakeholders that can put an objective view on plastic pollution and what we can do to reduce or rather eliminate this important problem for the world. So far, we have 72 members as for yesterday, welcoming Paraguay as the last one, and we hope to see more joining this initiative. In the case of Ecuador, we not only are part of this working group, but also, as have been mentioned, to the other two important working groups that have been established regarding to environments. The challenges that we have established here or seen in this first place is first, I would say important to take this approach in terms of the international trade. It's not an easy issue to approach, and I think that's the main discussion that we will be having. And probably not only on this, but in the other discussions as well, as how the trade policy and how the WTO can take abroad this problem and take solutions also on it. But the good thing is, and the challenge that we have, I believe, accepted and everybody should be in, because also, as Ms. Matthew has said, it's a problem that affects all of us, not only the 72 members, but all of us, all of the countries. So it'll be important, all the approaches that we can take on these discussions. We would like all the contribution of all members to this discussion to see for a working plan and through the specific actions that could be taken from the perspective of the WTO. This is the next thing that I wanted to signal is we all agreed that it needed to be addressed also from the perspective of the WTO, because this is something that is not only being managed or discussed here. There's actually an important initiative at UN about plastics, but the WTO could not take aside this dialogue and should put in front also a discussion. So I think that challenge has been addressed, and that's a good thing for all the members and a good thing for the organization, and of course for the stakeholders around the world. This puts a lot of challenges again on how we can exactly address, but it's important that we are taking a step forward. And for the next steps, we plan to have an upcoming meeting on the next month, on July actually, which is very close. And this will be separate from the results of the MC12 that we all hope that will be good for the outcome for the organizations. But there's a lot of work coming on regarding this subject. And I think we all agree that in the last years, especially all the topics about environment and this one on plastic pollution have been rising in importance. So it'll be good for us to take also this as a side matter that will be need to address and hopefully have a more structured discussion for the next ministerial conference. And regarding, I didn't want to let go also some reports that my country has been doing. As I said before, Ecuador is a small country when it comes to economy, in terms of economy. But when it comes to environment, rather it's a medium to large size country because of all the matters that it's been involved. And that's important for us to also show to the world, but also to use this to bring other members that have something to say in the table. And on this matter, that's why Ecuador has been leading also some discussions in other forums. And actually, Ecuador is leading the discussions about plastic pollution reforms in the UN. Our Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs is actually leading this discussion and hoping to proceed a new outcomes on this discussion. But at some point, it will need to come together with the work that we are trying to do here, and of course in other institutions and in other world forums as well. Just so all the stakeholders and people who are watching us would know, is Ecuador could be also highlighted because of its importance, not only because we hold one of the most important reserves in terms of marine resources, that is the Galapagos Island, that we take care a lot of, and recently we have just announced the growth of the protected area in Galapagos, but also because we have implemented some institutional reforms in terms of environment in our country that we want to show the world that a developing country can do and must do to address. And this is a work that we all need to be done. So we hope to put together all of these initiatives, all of this support that we can bring to the table, and of course be open to discussions and to concrete approach that the civil society, academia, and some others could bring to the table. But we're very pleased to be part of this group and some others regarding environment, and raise the bar, if you would say, on these subjects through the lens of international trade.
Very well said. Thank you very much. And really interesting points there, I think, about the need for coherence between what the WTO does and what we do in terms of trade policy and the rest of these initiatives. I'll pass the floor next perhaps to Toho. Go ahead, please.
Thanks very much, Alice. Firstly, of course, it's my great pleasure to be able to join you in this event together with Mr. Ng, Director Matthews, and Vice Minister Lagarde. Just over a week ago, I was at the Stockholm +50 Environment Sustainable Development Conference. And at that conference, I had the opportunity to recall to ministers of environment that the contribution of trade to the goal of sustainable development is actually enshrined in our founding agreement, the founding agreement of the WTO. So in that sense, you're absolutely right that trade and environment has had a long and unique place in WTO's institutional structure and history, and that this vision of multilateral cooperation on sustainable development actually led to the creation of the Committee on Trade and Environment. And I think, if we look at it from a historical perspective, through the CTE, links were made between environmental protection and development at large, with international trade playing an important role in poverty alleviation and in combating environmental degradation. So in a sense, I think, the emphasis of work in the CTE was and does continue to be on developing the mutual supportiveness and coherence between trade and environment. And we see that as well in measures taken by WTO members. We know that they increasingly see trade policy as a key part of their sustainability policies. And, they have notified something like more than 14,000 environmental measures to the WTO since 2009. So, over the years, the CTE has established itself as the forum in the WTO where members discuss and debate new measures, ideas, approaches, as we've heard today in this event, to addressing very pressing environmental challenges, as well as, potential win-win solutions. Of course, we have to also acknowledge that there have been challenges. There have been very intense political debates. But in all of this, if I dare say from a secretariat point of view, that we do see progress, and in a sense, the CTE has provided an umbrella, a sort of one-stop shop in the WTO for all of these discussions on trade and environment, as well as the place where you can actually communicate and have a very systematic dialogue with multilateral environmental agreements who regularly speak and report at the CTE. And in this area, we've also had the opportunity to strengthen WTO Secretariat cooperation with our partner agencies, with UNEP, UNFCCC, CITES, BASIL, and many others. And perhaps very directly to the comments made today, we've seen that the CTE has played a role as an incubator for new directions, very currently on things such as climate change, circular economy, plastics pollution. But it has also been there at the beginning. Actually, the mandate for the fisheries subsidies negotiations, which is so vital for MC12, came from proposals discussed at the CTE. And again, the initiatives taken on plastics, fossil fuel subsidies have also a link to discussions at the CTE. Now, just to conclude, the world today is certainly much more interconnected than it was 50 years ago, or even 25 years ago when the CTE was created. So I think this reality means that to achieve sustainable development, we certainly need to do more to align policies, build resilience to shocks, and drive trade, investment, and finance to meet the needs of our societies, essentially. The list of challenges is certainly long, but let's not forget that the list of opportunities for trade to be part of the sustainable development solution is also long. So we see through the discussions at the CTE and also in the 3 new environmental initiatives, many opportunities. And maybe to finish with what I started at Stockholm Plus 50, I heard many politicians, scientists, civil society leaders making it very crystal clear that while Stockholm is a good moment to celebrate what has been achieved, we have no second to waste. And I think the same no second to waste applies to us here at the WTO, particularly at our ministerial conference right now. And so with that, I believe the no second to waste also applies to our moderator, Alice.
It does.
So I won't continue any further and simply say, let's make trade work for the environment, people, and prosperity. Thank you very much.
Wonderfully said, Roland. Well, thank you very much all for these very insightful snapshots of the work underway under these important initiatives, and of course to the link back to multilateral trade and environment discussions. And I want to congratulate all of your governments for the leadership that you've shown in driving these discussions forward. These really are the defining challenges, I think, of our generation. It's also very useful input to the second part of our roundtable. So with that, I will sign off from room S3 and hand the moderation of the rest of the roundtable over to my colleague, Yeva. Go ahead, Yeva, please.
Thanks a lot, Alice, and welcome to the second part of our discussions, everyone. My name is Yeva Brzezinskaite. I'm a senior policy advisor at the IASD. It's a pleasure to help you transit from the excellent ministerial panel to this second stage of the event, where a knowledgeable and wide group of stakeholders will help us frame the scope of environmental challenges and see where the trade policy has a potential of becoming part of a solution. From fighting plastic pollution, preserving biodiversity and fish stocks, to battling deforestation and laying pathway to our Paris targets, the governments across the globe find themselves reaching into the trade toolbox and looking for the instruments that can be found there. Different regions are facing different environmental challenges due to slowly creeping in climate change, and I'm particularly delighted that we will also be able to hear about these later in our discussion. As a quick point of order, I will be inviting every speaker to take the floor and deliver the first intervention in around 5 minutes, leaving us approximately half an hour for a follow-up discussion and answer the questions. And thus, I invite the audience to use the Q&A box that you can find below under your screen to leave us any questions that you might have for any or all of the speakers, and we will see if we can get down to them at the last part of our event. Here, without any further ado, let me invite the first speaker, who is very, very familiar about the intersections between trade and nature, biodiversity, as pretty much one of the oldest multilateral cooperation forums for those two topics. I invite Beatriz Fernandez, the Associate Program Management Officer in Environment and Trade Division, United Nations Environment Program, as a speaker from whom I'm very much looking forward to hear more about where this partnership between trade and biodiversity can take us next. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Yeva, and thank you to IASD for the invitation to this wonderful roundtable. I'd like to start by saying that trade policy can play an important role to address environmental issues such as biodiversity loss. And the good news is that discussions on trade and environment in the multilateral setting have gained importance, and multilateral forums like the WTO and the Convention on Biological Diversity, they can play an important role to advance solutions at the nexus of trade and biodiversity. At the WTO, for example, by regulating trade of agricultural products that can have negative impacts on biodiversity, and also removing environmentally harmful subsidies. But also in the multilateral systems to address deforestation by facilitating an open and transparent platform for setting minimum international environmental standards for food and agricultural production. Last year, a report that was published by UNDP, UNEP, and FAO highlighted that agriculture contributes to 70% of biodiversity loss and 80% of deforestation. This report found that from 2013 to 2018, the support to farmers totaled an average of $540 billion a year. And 87% of this was harmful and had a huge damage on nature and climate. This support included price incentives for specific livestock and crops, subsidies for fertilizers and pesticides, and distorting export subsidies and import tariffs. Therefore, the WTO discussions on disabling environmentally harmful subsidies will be important to assess how trade can help to reform them and can also create opportunities to protect and preserve nature, but also to improve people's health. And equally, the Convention on Biological Diversity has a role in safeguarding measures to preserve biodiversity by removing harmful subsidies. The CVD provisions and international trade are linked through the production, the transformation, and the commercialization of based goods and services that can also create incentives for sustainable use of biodiversity. And more specifically, the upcoming 2030 Global Biodiversity Framework that aims to set an ambitious plan to fulfill its vision to live in harmony with nature by 2050 is currently proposing 21 targets and 10 milestones for 2030. And those that are with direct relevance to trade include redirecting and removing harmful subsidies for harmful incentives for biodiversity, the sustainable management of agriculture and forestry areas, and the reduction of pesticides, as well as the elimination of plastic waste discharge. The Conference of Parties asked the CVD Executive Secretary to closely interact with committees of the WTO on issues of mutual interest. And this is an important point that could be successful for the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework and to assess the impact of trade liberalization on biodiversity. I would also like to acknowledge that the discussion on biodiversity is incomplete without mentioning the fisheries subsidies negotiations. And I look forward to hearing more about it from Isabel participating in this panel. And just want to mention that UNEP has been collaborating with partners to support WTO members in negotiating this environmentally ambitious outcome. And we continue and look forward to supporting developing countries in the implementation of reforms at the international and national levels. And here I would like to conclude by perhaps start using the same start that I said. The good news is that trade and environment discussions are gaining importance in the multilateral setting. To say that it's increasingly evident the need for multilateral dialogue, for cooperation, where all countries participate in and where all parties will benefit from global efforts to advance trade systems that protect biodiversity. Thank you, Yeva.
Thank you so much, Beatrice, for this excellent presentation, but also for setting an excellent segue to our next speaker, Isabel Jarrett, who is a manager at the Charitable Trust and who for the last, I guess, 4 years has been actively involved in the fisheries subsidies work, and who, like many of us, is hoping that this ministerial conference will bring to a conclusion the 20-year-old negotiations. Isabel, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Eva, and thanks to everybody at ISD for asking me to be part of this fabulous panel this afternoon. And what a great way to be set up to speak, not only by Beatrice, but also by the ministers in the room who had to rush off to carry on negotiating. So I was going to say the word on everybody's lips is fish. And I thought I might be stretching a little bit, but no, really the word on everybody's lips is fish. And of course, I'm totally biased. But I wanted to, of course, try to answer the question that Eva posed to us about the role of multilateralism in tackling environmental problems. So as everybody's perhaps gathered from the ministers who opened this session, at MC12, WTO members really have a historic opportunity to demonstrate that multilateral trade policy instruments can deliver sustainability outcomes with a deal on fishery subsidies. And I just want to pull on something that Beatrice said about the Convention on Biological Diversity. Under CBD, there are existing commitments that that countries have made to eliminating harmful subsidies, as she said. And really, what we can see here at the WTO with multilateral trade policy is that this is a way that governments can deliver on their voluntary commitments in a binding, tangible way. And so the discussions at CBD and the discussions at the WTO are not happening in a vacuum. They're all very much interlinked. We know that when dealing with our global environmental and biodiversity crisis, that we're going to need to tackle them together, such as climate change, overfishing, which of course has to do with, fisheries subsidies is trying to address. We know we're going to need multilateral cooperation and ideally binding rules, not just voluntary commitments, although voluntary commitments are very much an important part of the puzzle to solve these problems adequately. Now, we know also that harmful fisheries subsidies have been tackled by dedicated chapters in regional trade agreements, such as the US-Mexico-Canada agreement. Now, it's our assessment that the current text on the table at the WTO is more ambitious than the USMCA or indeed other bilateral trade agreements, which is particularly remarkable because normally it's the other way around. Multilateral agreements are typically less ambitious than regional ones. So if 164 members can agree to a binding treaty this week, it really will be a historic achievement, not least because it's been more than 20 years of negotiations. But dealing with sustainability issues, which I think that Beatrice has indicated, and of course the ministers have indicated, is clearly of increasing importance on the WTO's agenda. Dealing with these sustainability issues also calls for members to be prepared to work in a different way than maybe they've been used to doing so in the past. Not just the fact that they'll have to deal with these different issues, but actually that they're going to have to think about a slightly different approach. And specifically, I think Holim mentioned this, these environmental issues will need to be dealt with ever increasing urgency. And so with perhaps one chapter of negotiations on fisheries subsidies closing this year after 20 years, I think that the other important question that I have for folks who know more about trade policy than I do and for governments is really thinking about how the WTO can react more swiftly to the problems that the environment faces and that we face, and that people and workers face, as Minister Ng said. It's also worth mentioning that the WTO Fisheries Subsidies Agreement is likely a blueprint for future agreements. It would not only level up the playing field by removing trade and sustainability distorting subsidies that are at the heart of the WTO's mandate. It's push for fairness, it's raising standards of living, and it's providing jobs. But it lays the groundwork for future WTO reform. You know, we see in the agreement tailored special and differential treatment. There's no longer sweeping carve-outs for developing countries, we hope. And I'd like to just close by reiterating something that Ambassador Wills said this morning in a meeting about the trust fund that's possibly being set up if an agreement is reached. Because I think it really gets to the heart of the question that I have for members, which is that when dealing with sustainability issues, it seems to me that WTO members are going to have to think about working differently. And allow me to just summarize. Ambassador Wills said, of course, not only are these negotiations on fisheries subsidies unique among the other negotiations happening right now at MC12 because they're about sustainability, but he also talked about trade-offs when asked a question about, whether there would be trade-offs between other issues and fisheries subsidies. He said, it's really difficult to trade off sustainability and trade off the future of global marine resources, and of course, the future of generations to come who will depend on the health of the ocean. So to conclude, I think that we can see with fisheries subsidies that absolutely we need multilateralism to solve these problems facing our global commons, but we also need multilateralism to adapt to these problems facing our global commons. And I hope to see in the very near future new approaches, new styles to really being able to address these problems in a swift and coherent way. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Isabel, and thanks a lot to outline the problems that multilateralism is facing with sustainability issues right now. But as we know, multilateralism consists of individual and regional members, and those are the perspectives that we invite to be presented right now. Jumping directly onto the next speaker in our panel, who is Prerna Prabhakar, a program associate in the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, bringing us perspective from the country that can be called the continent itself, with the set of issues around both trade and sustainability that we invite Prerna to present us.
Thanks, Eva, and thanks IST for organizing this interesting panel. So I'll quickly start off by just talking about briefly about how literature links trade and environment. So as researcher, when we try to understand what's the relationship between trade and environment, it's three broad channels that we use to study or analyze. The first one is the scale effect that we call, when you are manufacturing, goods to be exported, then it's said that it will always lead to, increase in emissions and it will be environmentally deteriorating. But then as you progress on your economic development, then two other effects come into play. The first one is the composition effect. So you transition from polluting goods to goods that are, environmentally improving and are called environmental goods. And then you end up, trading or exporting those goods. So, in that way, trade, it becomes a channel for improving environment for respective trading partners. Secondly, the third effect, is called the technique effect, which is similar to the composition effect, which says that when the two trading partners come together, then there's provision, there's opportunity to exchange technology, which will help us, which will facilitate us to produce environmental goods, which are environmentally improving in nature. So, this boils down to the fact, that I'm, going towards is that trade is a channel for improving environment in the respective trading partners. Now, given this hypothesis, now how do we go about doing it? How can we formulate trade policies that help us, in using trade as a channel for improving the environment in our respective countries to reaching our net zero goals? So for that, I will broadly talk about two broad things: trade in goods and then trade in services. Now, when we talk about trade in goods, there's a category of goods called environmental goods, which which are the type of goods that help minimize the pollution level, in the trading partners. So, something like, as we all know that, most of the countries now are transitioning from conventional sources of energy, which were based on fossil fuels, to renewable energy sources or other green energy sources like green hydrogen. So all this would require us to build, capacity within the country, for us to manufacture, let's say, solar energy or wind energy, or for that matter, green hydrogen. But then we have to think about, ponder upon a fact that, do we have the capacity in-house right now? So first of all, assessing the domestic capacity and, complement it with, importing the cost-effective raw materials, intermediate goods that would help us build that domestic capacity. So, contrary to people who argue that, imports would, help, imports would kill the domestic industry and would be detrimental to our domestic industry, I am of the view that it's a complementary process. So, while our domestic industry is building up, we are, importing the cost-effective inputs or raw materials that would help us build that domestic industry. So, for example, in a recent move by United States, they have waived off tariff on solar modules, solar cells by 4 Southeast Asian countries: Vietnam, Cambodia, Malaysia, and Thailand, because it has been recognized that for the solar manufacturing to proceed in a cost-effective manner, cost-effective fashion, we have to rely, until and unless we don't develop our domestic industry, we have to rely on the resources that are coming from some advantaged countries. So, such measures need to be adopted to facilitate what I call is the global factory for renewable energy sources, or for that matter, green hydrogen, which is a newer thing now in this space. So, for example, India has set a huge target for green hydrogen production, and then for that we require an equipment which is called an electrolyzer. So we need to first ourselves assess how much capacity do we have in the country to produce that, and if not, then probably we'll have to, meanwhile we are preparing for the domestic capacity, we'll have to get it from the countries that have already invested in it, have competitive edge in it, have price advantage resources. things like that. So so I was just trying to see what is the tariff levels currently are for such equipments that are being traded. So it goes like it goes up to 25% for some of the countries, and on an average it is around 1.7% or so, and even for India it's like 6 point something percent. So if we want to facilitate these industries, we'll have to slash these these tariff levels, so that we develop a global market to achieve that global net zero target, and also our respective net zero targets. So this is the first thing that I wanted to mention about the trade in goods. Now I'll come to the second thing, which is trade in services. How can that help in in us reaching our climate goals? So in creating the domestic capacity for renewable energy manufacturing, there are a lot of aspects that go into it. For example, technology, adequate resources, and one of the important factors is skilled labor. So and then there has been an analysis by LinkedIn, which is an online employment service provider, that in the coming years we are going to see a huge gap between the supply of green skills and the demand for green skills. So basically the supply, the demand will be way above what is being supplied in terms of green skills. So it's the right time that we invest in skilling, green skilling. And what I feel is that the global manufacturers through the FDI route, that are operating in, let's say in India, they can further invest in, just starting off the skilling centers in their, in their spaces where they have invested in India. So this is a right way for investing in something which would finally eventually give you a competitive product, which will be obviously environmentally friendly. So so this is one of, so the way we trade in education, I would say that adopting like trading and skilling would be something that going the services route to achieve the environmental friendly or environmental improving outcome. So this is the second channel, through services that we can adopt, and we all, the partner countries, the member countries should work together towards this collectively. Lastly, so not connected to these two, but then, as a researcher, what I have seen is that many of you, and especially people at WTO, would be familiar with the harmonized system of classification that, that is used in giving nomenclature to different product categories. There's like, it starts with two digit and then goes on to, as you disaggregate the product levels, it go on till 6 digit, 8 digits. Now, what I feel as a user, or even at the policy level, I would feel that there's enough scope to increase the transparency, for the way in which these HS codes are defined. So I know that these codes are revised every 5 years, and I think it's in 2022 we should be seeing the next revision of the HS classification. But in my usage of these classifications, I feel that even at the disaggregated level, it sometimes embodies even like the intermediate goods as well as the final goods. So for example, when working on the solar power components that go into producing solar energy. So there's a 6-digit category which captures the solar cells as well, and it also captures the modules that would be assembled from these solar cells. So it's very difficult to just gauge that what exactly is happening in terms of trade flow, what exactly, and also it has implications for assigning appropriate tariff levels when the consignment reaches the border. So I feel that because all the countries together collectively they report these HS classification, I feel that all the member countries need to think about ways in which these codes can be made more transparent, so that it helps the policymakers across the globe, and also the research community to know what's exactly is happening, and which way and what what extent of trade is happening and what extent of tariffs are being imposed. So this was one thing that, I thought that this is the right opportunity and the platform to discuss and to bring something like this up. So I thought that I'll finally conclude with something which needs more attention, and I'm open to views, and I look forward to the discussion ahead. Thank you.
Dear Farina, thanks a lot. It's really difficult to quickly outline the complexities of international trade when we talk about its assistance to the green transition. But here I invite Jean-Yves Remy, who will tell us the experience of a different part of the globe, of the Caribbean. And I invite her to just directly jump right in and outline her perspective. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Eva. I know we are stretched for time. I want to thank IISD for the invitation. And on a spin on the topic, I want to look at some approaches to advancing the climate change agenda at the WTO from an inclusive perspective of smaller island developing states. I am from a region on the front lines of climate change. We lie between tropics of Cancer and Capricorn near the equator, where in the words of one of our economists, sea levels have risen the highest, increasing temperatures to the greatest harm, and flooding, droughts, or hurricanes have intensified the most. Extreme weather events caused $320 billion in loss and damages in 2017 around the world, but 67% of that damage occurred in the Atlantic hurricane belt, with a country like Dominica losing 226% of GDP in just a few hours. In its most recent IPCC report on global impacts, vulnerabilities, and risks of climate change, the world scientists dedicated an entire chapter to the concerns of small states in the Pacific, Caribbean, and Indian Oceans. They concluded that small islands face an existential threat if global warming rises above 1.5. People, ecosystems, economies in the Caribbean will be significantly impacted due to loss of lives, decreased food and water security, bleaching of coral reefs, loss of infrastructure and settlements, degradation of human health and well-being, threats to biodiversity, and cultural resources and heritage. You will hear the Caribbean region articulating its specific need for global attention to the climate crisis in a number of fora: COP, the IMF and the World Bank, the GCF, even the Summit of the Americas. But beyond discussions on natural disasters in the WTO, the voice of the region in multilateral negotiations on trade has been fairly muted. This is strange for a region that is among the most vocal proponents of financing for loss and damaging adaptation, and calls for fairness and just transitions in the COP negotiations, and the need for technologies to transition their economies to low carbon economies. We are home to Barbados with a prime minister who is a climate change champion world leader and has declared for her country the fact that it will be the first green and fossil fuel free island in the world. And Guyana, which despite being the latest petro state with massive discoveries of oil that have propelled its growth to 40% rate, remains committed to a low carbon strategy. Trade and its twin companions of investment and financing policy are of course central to the aims of the region, but CARICOM states have not really placed a foothold in the WTO negotiations. And this is despite the growing preeminence of these discussions through the TESD ministerial work and statement, work of the CTE, and even work on natural disasters on the Committee on Trade and Development. At the center at which I work, what we have tried to do is start interrogating that interface between climate change and trade, proposing ways in which the CARICOM countries can show up more in trade discussions. And in my 3 remaining minutes, what I want to do is propose 5 tangible ways that I believe the Caribbean can move from the margins into some of the more central positions in the climate change negotiations at the WTO. Number 1, start with technical work. The WTO can help countries identify their own priorities and how they link to trade. The technical analyses of where regions and countries show up in tradable sectors and global value chains that stand to be most affected by climate change is critical. And I've seen the ODI, for instance, do that work with LDCs, but that work needs to also go towards work in SIDS. Another place to look in that technical work is in the aegis of the nationally determined contributions prepared for the UNFCCC. This engages a massive amount of work for national ministries. And it is clear that some of the priorities articulated there have a trade component. For instance, in my region, some of the priorities are framed in terms of reduction in tariffs or work towards greater labeling and standards. This is a good place for the WTO technical work to start, since it will allow us to track how far countries are utilizing trade rules and instruments to fulfill their climate ambitions. It may also help WTO negotiators to articulate in greater ways their needs in the various committees where climate change is being discussed. Two, and relatedly, there is a need for greater harmonization, and we've heard that for the past in all the presentations, greater harmonization of the technical work agendas at the UNFCCC, the WTO, and of course, the UN Sustainable Development Goal. And this is particularly important for smaller countries where resources are scarce and these discussions still take place in silos. The WTO can align its agenda with the work programs. For instance, technology needs assessments that are developed under the aegis of the UNFCCC can be considered as part of negotiations on aid for trade and the Committee for Technology Transfer. Especially important for our region is linking the financial needs for climate change to what the international donors and grant agencies are doing and bringing that into the center of WTO discussions. Three, I think there's room for better coordination of work programs, even across WTO committees. There is work being done under, we've heard, for instance, the joint initiatives, the CTE, even natural disasters and the Committee on Trade and Development. One idea would be to establish reporting mechanisms on a regular basis across the different committees so that we know what's happening. Both the negotiators in both sets of negotiations know what's happening. Four, it's important, I think, to help clarify the work programs and substantive areas of overlap. My center is beginning to do more of the research in this area. And in some ways, it feels as if almost everything is now climate change, whether it is the environment generally, fossil fuels, the circular economy, food security, agriculture, and fisheries. They are all affected by and affect climate change. But these engage separate discussions sometimes at the WTO. How do we ensure that climate change should not just bleed into other areas and lose its distinctness? And I think the creation of a specific working group under the TESD initiative will be helpful. And five, consider the specific needs of small island developing states. Whilst there is recognition of LDCs as deserving of special attention, SIDS have yet to be formally recognized as a distinct negotiating group in the context of some of these discussions. SIDS are struggling still for legitimacy as a group, which is in contrast, I believe, to how other international fora are treating their concerns. For instance, the UNFCCC refers specifically to small island developing states, and the IPCC, its report as well. The work that is being done, for instance, in the Caribbean, the Central Development Bank, in coming up with a climate vulnerability index should find its way into some of the work happening at the WTO. I'll stop here because I know I'm out of time, and I will look forward to some questions and conversations. Thank you so much, Eva.
Thank you so much. And it's just excellent to hear not about problems, but also about the solutions that must start emerging, or at least the ways forward. However, here I invite the third perspective and the perspective of pretty much the rule setting or the pioneer region right now as it comes to climate change and trade instruments relation. I invite Pierre Le Tour, the senior policy analyst from Institute of European Environmental Policy, to present the EU ideas that have just been showing up all across the press over last week and tell us what it means not only for the EU, but also for the countries like Caribbean or India, whom we just heard from. Thanks a lot, Pierre.
Thank you so much, Eva. And I would like to thank the IISD and all the co-organizers for convening this very timely roundtable. So as you've said, my intervention will focus on border carbon adjustments in the EU context and multilateral trade cooperation for the climate. So I would like to start with a brief word on the policy context on the European side and the paradigm shift that the EU's trade policy is currently undergoing. What we are currently witnessing is a slow, but nonetheless real paradigm shift regarding the objectives that European trade policy shall pursue. As Commissioner Dombrovskis said just yesterday, it's true to say that the EU trade agenda is the greenest ever. The question now is it really green enough? Since the beginning of the new Commission's mandate, we've seen a blossom of unilateral initiatives and trade impacting autonomous measures with extraterritorial effect. So to give you a few examples, you have the recently adopted deforestation-free products initiative, of course, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, on which I will focus a bit more, the directive on corporate sustainable due diligence, and last but not least, the discussions on mirror measures initiated under the French presidency of the Council very recently. So though this is not only a European trend, but a global trend, taking a look at the discussions in the committees for trading goods or the TBT committee at the WTO, one can note that more and more countries are using trade measures to achieve environmental objectives. So now I would like to make 3 points to say that these market or trade-related initiatives with extraterritorial effects are legitimate, but they are suboptimal. And to conclude on the fact that their implementation, with all the challenges that they raise, also highlight the need for enhanced pluri and multilateral cooperation. So first of all, they are legitimate and compliant with international law. So even if border carbon adjustments are meant to avoid carbon leakage, we've heard some voices recently opposed to BCA saying that they would be inconsistent with the common but differentiated responsibilities principle. Well, I'd like to say that the Paris Agreement, however, does not land on a lower common denominator, but require the members to take concrete action to address the common concern that is climate change. So if you look at already in 1992, in the Rio Agreement, the agreement stressed the importance to balance the rights of the states with the interests of the international community. So the CBDR principle should not be interpreted as a restriction of measures with extraterritorial impact, but rather in the light of this urgency to act that we have now with climate. So the whole challenge here consists in articulating the duty to cooperate, enshrined in Article 55 of the UN Charter or in Article 7 of the Rio Agreement, with a duty to act. Looking closer at the Paris Agreement, at what the Paris Agreement says, once a member has chosen to step up efforts, it's absolutely legitimate to try and incentivize other partners to do the same, because essentially what we are trying to protect here are global goods. So in the same vein, looking at WTO laws, they do not constitute an obstacle to the implementation of such measures, granted that they do not represent disguised protectionism or unjustified discrimination. Second point, they are suboptimal, however, and three main reasons for that. First reason, they lead to chaotic and uncoordinated treatment of global issues, potentially leading to trade disruptions or retaliatory behaviors. Just look at the UK, the US, Canada. Now, a lot of countries are becoming somehow more serious about setting standards on low carbon productions or implementing a carbon pricing, and they are contemplating implementing at the same time border carbon adjustments. Second reason, these measures open the door to bilateral arrangements, which in some cases could be worse. Here, the example is the EU-US green steel and aluminum arrangement, which is first and foremost meant to reduce over time the Trump tariffs on EU steel and aluminium, but which comprises a real risk of seeing the two parties agree on mutual exemptions from border carbon measures. Third reason for them to be suboptimal, they carry with them a necessary adaptation costs. And what the EU, for instance, needs to make sure is that this adaptation cost does not represent a too high burden, especially for small producers in developing or in least developed countries. Hence, the necessity to develop, to mobilize CBAM revenues to help decarbonization efforts in LDCs, for instance, which is one of the recommendations that IEP and the Green Trade Network that we coordinate have made. Which leads me to my final point very quickly. The third point, we need more international cooperation on specific issues, such as linking trade opportunities with the horizon of a climate neutral economy. As you all know, the appellate body famously stated in the US gasoline case in 1996 that WTO laws cannot be interpreted in clinical isolation from international convention. But this does not only mean that international law doesn't constitute an obstacle to the application of WTO laws, but also that WTO laws themselves and trade cooperation shall also actively contribute to the achievement of other obligations stemming from international commitments. The question that WTO members should ask themselves urgently is how the multilateral trading regime can contribute to the creation of comparative advantages for environmentally sound technologies, technologies more efficient, more renewable based, etc. What is crucially needed here is the creation, the emergence of an enabling environment for the diffusion of these technologies. On carbon neutral production specifically, this will require enhanced cooperation on climate-related standards, the implementation of mutual recognition schemes of carbon accounting methods, but also further work on sectoral low carbon standards in ISO, in the International Standards Organization. But also, what I want to stress is that an agreement on green procurement will also be essential to the swift decarbonization of some sectors that are covered by CBAM, notably those of the building sector, given that public bodies represent a huge share of the demand in certain goods such as cement, steel, or concrete. So having at least, let's say, the 10 biggest consumers of such products agree on green procurement rules and standards would send, I would say, a strong signal to these markets and help them decarbonize swiftly. And to come back to BCAs, it's the same. If countries could agree on principles, on guidelines for CBAM, there would certainly be much less risk of seeing some jurisdictions implementing border adjustments that fail to respect principles of fairness, of non-discrimination, of co-ownership of the revenues, everything that we've been calling for with the Green Trade Network. So the recent chaos that we've witnessed in the European Parliament during the vote on the emission trading scheme and CBAM are proving one more time that there are some debates that should not be left exclusively to the political debates and which require diplomatic engagement and resource mobilization to be internationally acceptable. So yes, for instance, environmental good agreements, negotiations have been stalled for years, but though encouraging steps have been taken at the plurilateral and multilateral levels, with the initiative on plastics, with TESSD, I very much commend with what has been presented by ministers early on, the ministerial initiative on trade and climate, finally to conclude, which was announced just yesterday and which is bringing very good news and in which we hope that something will be done regarding all the issues raised by the necessity to swiftly decarbonize the highly intensive sectors. And thank you so much again for the invitation.
Thanks a lot, Pierre, and this is excellent. I think that each and every topic already discussed could become each own session. And here, I also thank you for just mentioning Trade and Climate Ministerial meeting, because I know that our next speaker will have been there in person. And we invite Caroline Dierberg, the Director of Forum on Trade, Environment and the SDGs, to take the floor and tell us more about one of the initiatives that has already been mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, and tell us a bit more how trade can help fight plastic pollution. Caroline, the floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you, Yeva, and to IISD for organizing this excellent discussion today. At TESS, we're great fans of the work of IISD and are very happy to work with others to co-host this session today. So I'm going to focus my remarks on plastic pollution. So interest in trade and plastic pollution is underpinned by the fact that international trade across the life cycle of plastics accounts for at least 5% of international trade and was worth over $1 trillion in 2019. Now, these plastic trade flows are relevant to plastic pollution for three core reasons. The first is that trade flows of plastic waste to countries with inadequate waste management systems exacerbate the leakage of plastics into the environment. Plastic trade flows are also relevant because trade in plastic products, as well as products containing plastics and pre-packaged in plastics, add to the waste management burden and pollution burden of importing countries. Now, trade and investment also connect the international supply chains through which plastics are produced and distributed. So in this context, no country alone can transform international supply chains. Countries need to work together to transform them and end the pollution that they create. So alongside trade, trade policies are also relevant to plastic pollution, and many countries are already introducing import restrictions and bans on certain types of plastic waste and plastic products. And also, many countries are taking plastic reduction and circularity measures that have trade implications. So it's important that all of these measures are coherent, coordinated, and transparent in order to enable better environmental outcomes. And there are several pathways for boosting trade-related cooperation. One is to bolster implementation of the Basel Convention's plastic waste amendments that aim to better regulate trade in plastic waste. There's also opportunities in the context of the new legally binding of negotiations for the new legally binding international treaty on plastic pollution. Here, governments could consider control measures, including how they can use trade, measures, regulations, and policies to incentivize shifts that will reduce plastic pollution. And there's also work underway in organizations such as UNCTAD and the OECD, which are relevant to trade dimensions of plastic pollution. But as we're here alongside MC12 and time is short, let me focus just on the efforts at the WTO in the informal dialogue on plastic pollution and environmentally sustainable plastics trade. So as Minister Lagarde noted in his remarks, the IDP began as a developing country-led initiative started by Fiji and China and launched in 2020. And from early 2021, it has now 6 co-conveners. And at the end of last year, they issued a ministerial statement, which now has 71 co-sponsors. What's really remarkable about this group is its commitment to a cooperative approach to their work, both in the fact that they have 6 coordinators, and also that it's a really diverse group of countries, and particularly with a diverse group of developing countries from small islands to least developed countries. And part of this reason, of course, is that developing countries are particularly affected by the impact of plastic pollution and the trade dimensions of that. So in this statement, they argue for addressing the trade-related aspects of plastic pollution and to identifying opportunities for cooperation. What's also impressive in the statement is they're very specific on identifying what are some trade-related issues that they can focus on. They commit to looking for concrete, pragmatic, and effective outcomes at the latest by MC13. And it's also impressive their commitment to engaging with a diversity of different stakeholders and seeking their inputs. So just to be super quick, some of the particular areas that they have identified as areas for work are improving understanding of global trade in plastics across the life cycle, as well as the flow of information about the chemical and material characteristics of plastic products that are traded internationally. They also want to enhance transparency of trade policies that countries are undertaking and to address the capacity building and technical assistance needs of developing countries, especially LDCs. And to Yaniv's point earlier, they do specifically mention vulnerable SIDS in their statement. They're also looking to support actions in other international processes, including by fostering cooperation around standards that will be vital to shifting towards more sustainable supply chains. And finally, and I think the most exciting part of their work is their commitment to looking at how trade-related cooperation can help reduce unnecessary or harmful plastics and plastic products. and also how they can promote trade in goods, services, and technologies that will support efforts to reduce plastic pollution, including, for instance, trade in non-plastic substitutes. Now, this year, the members outlined a work plan, which has, they're working through 4 plenary sessions and a set of work streams. One is on promoting trade to tackle plastic pollution, another is on circularity and reduction. And they also have a work stream on cross-cutting issues. And in great news, this week, just yesterday, the coordinators held a press conference to provide an update on their work. And they are working already on a voluntary survey on trade-related measures that countries are taking to reduce plastic pollution, on a needs assessment for aid for trade, and noted their intention to deepen engagement with the World Customs Organization on trade-related aspects of plastic pollution, and with UNCTAD to work on plastic substitutes and alternatives. So just to close, I think the real innovation of the IDP processes is that governments, a really diverse group of countries, really powered by the engagement of developing countries, but also working with developed countries, are really working to see how they can address a global challenge, finding new ways of working, new kinds of outcomes, and also a real engagement with stakeholders along the way. So thank you, Yeva.
Thanks, Ron. Thanks a lot, Caroline. And I want to thank all of our excellent speakers, whom I feel like have been a bit deprived of a discussion because we're running out of time. But Caroline, while I still have you on the screen, can I just ask you one question? With 164 ministers in town, what's the one thing that you wish, or one thing that you could ask from them?
Oh, this week at the WTO, well, they must follow Isabel's advice and the great work of IISD, and they must reach a meaningful deal on the reform of fishery subsidies. I think that is the single most important and urgent thing that they need to do this week.
Thanks, Caroline. And I'm also asking our panelists if they have any wishes to send to the ministers. Please raise a hand and I'll invite you. I see Genevieve. Shall we jump in?
Yes, I saw the meeting yesterday, I think, on trade and climate change. It was a breakfast meeting that was organized. I would love to see a Caribbean minister be part of the leading voices on the climate change initiative at the WTO.
This is the Caroline. Do you have a
I just wanted to jump in straight away, Yaniv, just to reassure you that there were 2 Caribbean countries represented there yesterday, and I know the co-hosts are absolutely committed to having a number of SIDS involved in the initiative. And actually, your minister from St. Vincent did a just fantastic job. She opened the discussion on the floor, so she was really able to frame that. So absolutely, I agree.
We're getting there.
If no more panelists want to send their message to the ministers who are in town but definitely busy in the meeting rooms, I would probably move to the thanking part of this discussion. Really, I would want to thank each and every single excellent panelist that have been participated with us. This is just amazing. How many perspectives we managed to fit in this short session, and how much more remains to be said by each and every one of you. So I encourage all the attendees of this session, both of those who joined us on a virtual mode and those who were there in our watching panel just downstairs, the ISD offices, to browse more, to Google those excellent people and to see more of their work online. And you will find that they are really definitely a source of wisdom on much more than they have been able to present in our short session today. With this, our event is coming to the end, but I would want to invite all of our participants to not stay away from us for too long. We'll have another virtual session on digitalization and e-commerce tomorrow. And for those who have been watching it from the International Environment House, once you grab a coffee, you are very welcome to join our partners' Queen's University session towards multi-purpose trade policy, how competing narratives about globalization are reshaping international trade cooperation. That will start right after the session at 3:15. With this, I thank all of you who have been with us here today. I want to thank all of our session co-organizers for their help and support, and I'm really looking forward to talk to all of you soon. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Eva. Thanks. Bye.